Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Let's step back into the bustling streets of ancient Rome, a city of marble temples, roaring arenas, and crowded markets where nearly everything had a price tag. And yes, that even included people. Slavery was not a side note in Roman society, it was its very backbone. From the grand estates of senators to the workshops of artisans, slaves powered nearly every aspect of daily life. But here's the chilling part. Human lives were bought and sold with the same practicality as livestock, tools, or grain. And just like in any market, the cost of a slave depended on age, skills, appearance, and demand. A young, strong farmhand might fetch a decent price because he promised years of hard labor. A skilled Greek tutor, fluent in literature and philosophy, could sell for many times more, prized as much for status as for usefulness. On the other hand, an older or less healthy slave might be considered discount stock, sold cheaply, sometimes in bulk. Prices weren't fixed, they fluctuated like the modern housing or job markets. Wars often flooded Rome with captives, driving prices down. But when supply dried up, or when the wealthy competed for the most beautiful entertainers or the most educated scribes, costs soared. Walking through a Roman slave market would have been a surreal and unsettling experience. Rows of men, women, and children stood on display, with signs around their necks listing their origins, skills, and health. Buyers inspected them like merchandise, checking teeth, muscles, and scars, asking about training and background. Behind every number was a life, a story reduced to a transaction. In Rome, the question wasn't whether someone could afford bread or wine, it was whether they could afford to own another person. In the Roman world, the price of a slave wasn't abstract, it was counted out in jingling coins. Usually denarii or sesterti, the currencies that kept the empire running. And just like modern price tags, these amounts revealed staggering differences depending on the type of slave being sold. For a basic, unskilled laborer, someone fit for farm work, hauling loads, or serving in a household, the price might range from 500 to 2,000 denarii. That's already a fortune, considering a common Roman soldier earned about 900 denarii a year. To put it simply, buying even a cheap slave could cost more than an entire year of a soldier SP. But the market didn't stop there. Skilled slaves, scribes, cooks, artisans, or tutors could command far higher prices. A Greek tutor, steeped in philosophy and rhetoric, might fetch 6,000 denarii or more, especially if destined to educate the children of a wealthy senator. Female slaves considered beautiful or trained in music, dance, or household management could sell for astronomical sums, sometimes equivalent to the price of a fine villa. At the very top of the market, the numbers became dizzying. There are records of slaves selling for as much as 100,000 sestertia, some so vast it placed them among the most valuable assets a Roman could own, rivaling estates, ships, or herds of cattle. In such cases, it wasn't just about usefulness, it was about prestige. Owning such a slave was a statement of wealth and power, a way to impress guests and intimidate rivals. On the other end of the spectrum, there were bargain bins. Prisoners of war captured in bulk could be sold at rock-bottom prices, sometimes just a few coins each, especially when markets overflowed after a major campaign. These unfortunate souls were often sent straight to the mines or gladiator schools, their lives expected to burn out quickly under brutal conditions. The slave market of Rome was, in every sense, an economy of human lives, where the value of a person was weighed not by dignity or soul, but by coin, skill, and circumstance. Rome was an empire built on conquest, and with every new victory came spoils. Gold and silver filled the treasury, exotic animals thrilled crowds in the arena, but the most common prize was people. War after war brought waves of captives. Gauls, Greeks, Syrians, Britons, Carthaginians marched in chains through triumphal parades before being sold in markets like livestock. For Rome, slaves were not just the byproduct of war, they were the fuel that allowed the empire to expand, farm new lands, and enrich its elite. After massive campaigns, markets in Italy could be flooded with thousands of captives at once, creating a brutal kind of economics. Supply skyrocketed, and prices plummeted. A single coin might purchase a prisoner of war destined for the mines, where his life expectancy was measured in months. But in times of peace, or when demand for skilled labor rose, prices soared again. Wars, in other words, dictated not only the borders of the empire, but also the cost of a human life. For the Roman elite, this abundance was a blessing. Vast estates, known as latifundia, stretched across the countryside, worked by gangs of slaves producing grain, wine, and olive oil for export. These plantations were only possible because of the endless influx of cheap labor. Meanwhile, urban households swelled with servants from every corner of the known world: Celtic maids, Greek tutors, Syrian cooks, each slave a reminder of Rome's dominance. But there was a darker side. The cheap flood of enslaved labor undercut free Roman peasants, many of whom found themselves unable to compete with vast estates powered by captive hands. Small farmers abandoned their plots, swelling the population of Rome itself, where unemployment and unrest grew. Thus, the very victories that made Rome rich also sowed seeds of social tension. A city dependent on conquest, addicted to slaves, and restless when wars slowed. In this way, every campaign reshaped the market of flesh. Prices rose and fell like tides, but one constant remained: wherever Rome marched, chains followed. To understand the true weight of slavery in Rome, we can just look at markets and prices. We have to step inside the daily lives of the enslaved. Imagine waking up before dawn, not to the sound of roosters or family chatter, but to the bark of an overseer, the clatter of chains, or the call of a master, who owned not just your labor but your very existence. Life as a slave in Rome varied wildly depending on where fate had placed you. For those forced into the mines, existence was brutal and short. The air underground was thick with dust and poison, the tunnels dangerous, the punishments merciless. Few survived long enough to see old age, and many were worked to death within years. On the great agricultural estates, the latifundia slaves formed gangs, laboring under the Mediterranean sun to harvest wheat, olives, and grapes. Overseers, often themselves former slaves given authority, enforced discipline with whips and iron chains. Housing was cramped, food was meager, and punishment was swift for anyone who lagged behind. These were lives defined by exhaustion, hunger, and fear. But not all slaves lived under the same shadow. In the cities, some held specialized roles. Greek tutors taught aristocratic children philosophy and rhetoric, becoming status symbols for their wealthy owners. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths, scribes, cooks, and healers were often hired out, earning money for their masters while carving out small spaces of relative comfort for themselves. Female slaves might manage entire households, balancing authority over other servants, while remaining under constant threat of exploitation. There were also the entertainers, dancers, musicians, and, at the lowest end, gladiators, men forced to fight to the death in front of roaring crowds. Their bloodshed turned into spectacle. For them, survival was uncertain, but fame could be a double-edged sword, winning admiration yet never freedom. Still, even for those in privileged positions, the truth remained. They were property. Their bodies could be sold, traded, or punished at a master's whim. They could be separated from families without warning, stripped of dignity, and reminded daily that no matter their skill or status, they were not their own. And yet, within this harsh reality, slaves found ways to endure. They whispered songs from their homelands, shared stolen moments of laughter, formed bonds with others who carried the same chains. Some even managed to earn trust and responsibility, opening rare paths to freedom. Life was harsh, often cruel, but it was also filled with resilience, the quiet strength of those who refused to let Rome break their spirit entirely. In Rome, the daily life of a slave was a spectrum of suffering and survival, luxury and despair, where the line between privilege and punishment could shift with a master's temper. For most slaves in Rome, life seemed like a sentence without end. Yet, surprisingly, there was one thread of hope woven into the harsh fabric of bondage: the possibility of freedom. Rome, unlike many ancient societies, allowed for manumission, the legal act of setting a slave free. It was no easy road, and only a fraction of the enslaved ever reached it. But for those who did, the transformation was extraordinary. Freedom could come in different ways. Some slaves earned it through loyal service, gradually winning their master's trust and gratitude. Others saved tiny sums of money, wages earned when hired out for skilled labor, and eventually bought their own liberty. A few were freed by a master's will after death, granted release as a final act of generosity or guilt. There were even formal ceremonies, where a master touched the slave with a rod before a magistrate, declaring them free before the law. But freedom was not just symbolic. A manumitted slave became a libertus, a freedman, and though they carried the shadow of their servile past, they also gained rights, opportunities, and most importantly, the chance to shape their own destiny. Many freedmen became merchants, artisans, and even wealthy businessmen. Some amassed fortunes that rivaled those of the old aristocracy, building tombs that proudly proclaimed their new identities and achievements. Still, freedom was never absolute. A freedman remained tied to their former master as a client, owing respect, loyalty, and often a portion of their earnings. Social prejudice lingered as well. Senators and nobles looked down on freedmen as tainted by slavery, regardless of their wealth. Yet in the bustling streets of Rome, money often spoke louder than bloodlines. Freedmen built influential networks, sponsored public works, and even rose to positions of civic importance. For many slaves, the mere dream of freedom was enough to endure another day of toil, another lash of the whip. It was a fragile light in the darkness, a reminder that their story might not end in chains. And for Rome itself, manumission was more than an act of mercy. It was a mechanism that absorbed former slaves into society, binding them with loyalty and gratitude, and turning the oppressed into participants in the empire's vast machine. Freedom in Rome was therefore both real and limited, hopeful and conditional. It was a doorway not everyone could reach, but for those who stepped through it, life began on new proof that, even in a world built on domination, there was room, however narrow, for rebirth. Not every slave endured Rome's system in silence. While many clung to the faint hope of freedom through manumission, others resisted in ways both small and seismic. Resistance could be subtle tools broken by accident, work done slowly, secret thefts of food or coins, or whispered songs that preserved identities Rome tried to erase. These quiet acts were often invisible in the grand sweep of history, but they were daily sparks of defiance, proof that even in chains, the human spirit resisted total domination. Yet sometimes those sparks ignited into fire. The most famous example was the Great Revolt led by Spartacus in 73 BC. A Thracian gladiator trained for blood sport in the arena, Spartacus escaped his captors with a band of fellow slaves. What began as a desperate flight swelled into a full-scale rebellion as tens of thousands of slaves joined him, armed with stolen weapons, farm tools, and sheer determination. For nearly 2 years, this ragtag army defied Rome's legions, winning battle after battle and sending tremors through the Republic. For the Roman elite, the revolt was a nightmare come alive. The very foundation of their wealthy endless supply of enslaved labor suddenly looked fragile. Senators feared not just defeat, but the collapse of the social order itself. And though Rome ultimately crushed the rebellion in brutal fashion, lining the Appian Way with the crucified bodies of Spartacus' followers, the memory of it lingered. It was a reminder that the system was not unshakable, that beneath the surface of Roman grandeur pulsed a deep and dangerous resentment. But revolt wasn't always so dramatic. There were countless smaller uprisings, escapes, and conspiracies scattered across the empire. Groups of slaves fought for freedom in Sicily, Spain, and beyond, while individuals risked everything to flee into the countryside or hide in the crowded backstreets of Rome. Most were caught and punished, often with terrifying cruelty, but their attempts told a larger truth. The enslaved were not passive cogs in the Roman machine. They struggled, they resisted, and they dreamed of breaking their chains. In the end, Rome maintained its grip, but never without fear. Every lash of the whip carried the risk of rebellion. Every overseer knew the danger of pushing too far. And while Spartacus himself fell, his name survived as a symbol not just of failure, but of courage, a reminder that even against the mightiest empire on earth, men in chains dared to fight for freedom. When we look back at Rome, it is tempting to focus only on its grandeur, its marble temples, glittering forums, and monumental arenas. But beneath that polished stone lay a foundation built on human bondage. Slavery was not a side note to Roman civilization, it was its engine. From the wine poured at feasts to the books copied in libraries, from the villas that lined the countryside to the very aqueducts that carried water into the city, the fingerprints of enslaved labor were everywhere. The legacy of this system is both undeniable and unsettling. On one hand, slavery allowed Rome to expand faster, build higher, and dominate longer than many other societies of its age. It created an economy capable of feeding millions and supporting an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, but it also hollowed out the very society it sustained. By relying so heavily on coerced labor, Rome undermined its free peasants, widened the gulf between rich and poor, and planted seeds of unrest that echoed across centuries. Culturally, the mark of slavery endured long after the empire itself crumbled. The Latin word servus, meaning slave, became the root of words for servitude across Europe, embedding the memory of bondage into language itself. Roman laws and customs about ownership of people influenced medieval societies, and the echoes of Rome's slave economy haunted later civilizations that revived slavery on even larger scales. Perhaps the most haunting legacy, however, is the normalization of inequality. In Rome, the sight of chained men and women in markets was ordinary. Children grew up watching others bought and sold, believing it was natural that some lives could be owned by others. This acceptance of human beings as commodities, so deeply ingrained in Roman culture, would leave a scar on the world that lasted long after the empire's fall. And yet, alongside the cruelty, Rome also preserved stories of resilience. In tomb inscriptions, in whispered songs, in the legend of Spartacus, we glimpse the humanity that refused to be extinguished. These fragments remind us that slavery did not define the enslaved, it defined Rome. The Roman Empire may have collapsed, its temples weathered into ruins, but the questions it left behind remain sharp and uncomfortable. How do societies justify the ownership of others? How far will people go to preserve power and comfort at the expense of human dignity? And what lessons, if any, will we choose to learn from the empire that built greatness on the suffering of so many? As we leave behind the streets of Rome, the crowded slave markets, the echoing arenas, the endless estates, tilled by hands that never owned their labor, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The greatness of an empire was carried on the backs of those denied even the right to call themselves human. Rome dazzled the world with its aqueducts, armies, and laws. But behind the marble facades stood lives broken, bought, and forgotten. Slavery in Rome was not simply an institution, it was a worldview. It declared that some were born to command and others to obey, that dignity could be divided by coin, and that freedom was a privilege, not a right. And yet, even within this brutal system, people resisted, endured, and sometimes triumphed, reminding us that no chain, however heavy, can silence the human will entirely. The echoes of Rome's slavery did not vanish with its empire. They bled into the Middle Ages, resurfaced in the colonial world, and still haunt the global memory of inequality today. Rome may be long gone, but its shadow lingers, a mirror forcing us to examine our own world more closely. Because the ultimate question Rome leaves us with is not about the cost of a slave in denarii or sestertii, but about the value we place on human life itself. 2,000 years later, can we truly say we have learned? Or do we still carry, in subtler forms, the same chains Rome once forged?